Alright you guys, this is your next Q&A. I know it's been a minute since I dropped a Q&A, but we're going to start doing them on a consistent basis again. As always, you guys had a lot of good questions. If I didn't get you on this one, I'll try to get you on the next one. Without further ado, let's get straight to it. So Diego wants to know, what do you think about how PC gangs are getting more powerful than the mainline ones? I personally don't care because I'm no longer a part of that lifestyle and I don't have a dog in that fight. However, I think it should serve as a wake-up call and an eye-opener for those who are still active. It should serve as a subtle reminder that there's something wrong with how these active gangs are operating. The fact that there's so many dropouts and that so many gang members are dropping out is the proof. All this started back in the mid-90s. Before then, you didn't see these guys dropping out on a daily basis. There was cohesion, unity, carnalismo, and the morale was peaking. But then something changed. I personally believe that it had something to do with the vision and the direction that these organizations were moving in. Money became the root of internal strife, and good people began getting cannibalized in the process. This eventually turned people away, and a lot of these guys weren't tired gang members that wanted to get out of the game. They were just discouraged and tired of being pushed and pulled in the wrong direction. They still wanted to play the game. They just didn't want to play it the way that they were being forced to. That's why a lot of these guys went to these S and Ys and recreated themselves within these dropout gangs. While these active gangs continue to cannibalize and self-destruct, these dropout gangs are only becoming stronger and continue to grow in numbers. I think if things don't change and they continue the way it has, that the active gangs are going to become so depleted that eventually they'll risk becoming defunct. Can it be possible that CDC or CDCR can have both in the same yard and have AB, NF, MA band together to bust these people? This was asked by the same individual. Of course, if they continue to merge these yards and put all these different gangs together, eventually the active gangs are going to begin to realize that the only way that they can combat this problem is to band together and do it in unison. It'll basically come down to active versus non-active. For the active gangs, they'll be fighting to preserve the integrity of active gangs and their continued presence within these mainlines. That's what they'll be fighting for. Their continued existence and self-preservation. For the non-actives, they'll be fighting for the acquisition or the takeover of the mainlines, to push out and purge the actives altogether. This is what is playing out right now. And are you yourself a playboy? No, I am in no way affiliated or associated with the Northern Riders. I have nothing against them, nor do I have any issues with them. But their fight is not my fight. I just don't see no purpose in going from one criminal organization to another, only to get right back into the politics, the political jostling, the betrayal, the backstabbing, and the internal detraction. I would never involve myself with any other criminal organization again. Not just the Northern Riders, but any other group for that matter. So the Martin 9400 wants to know, Inner Demons number 16, Susanville didn't have mandatory movement. What happened to the individuals that didn't go to chow? Theoretically, yes, there was mandatory movement, but nobody enforced it. These ends were put on notice and were told of the impending conflict that was about to kick off on the yard, but the majority of them elected to stay back in their cells and avoid the conflict altogether. As far as what happened to them, some of them were victimized by the Southsiders. Some of them just waited for the conflict to resolve, and then anybody that was somebody got deemed if they stayed back. It was basically an act of cowardice on a mass level. Were any of the regular norteños that participated elevated to hermanos? Yes, those that stepped up and participated were given the option of recruitment. Some took that step, while others elected to maintain their status as just northerners. Were any of the Southsiders expecting this act of aggression? You would think, after being warned by a credible source of your intentions, they'd be on their toes. As I articulated in my spill, someone leaked out information exposing our intention to engage that day. And as a result, I'm sure they were on their toes and were anticipating something might happen. But at the end of the day, there wasn't nothing they could have done different. I mean, they could have put all their faith in the rumor that was leaked to them, and they could have struck first. But if you remember the conversation I had with Eddie Boy from Dinuba, one of their leaders, they wanted to avoid any conflict if at all possible, and they allowed me to rock them back to sleep. I'm sure they still had doubts after talking to me, as I was still an adversary. But for the most part, I really think they bought into the things that I told them. Were the Africanos upset this incident took place in the chow hall and their members at risk? If they were, they didn't address it. They were put on notice as well. I personally gave a lot of the Bay Area Africanos a heads up so they knew and didn't just get blindsided. Besides that, this would have been the wrong position for them to take. It was prison, conflicts arise, and that's just something that they had to contend with. Were you guys obligated to alert the blacks beyond making sure none of their people are at the wrong place at the wrong time when it went down? Obligation? No, I think obligation is the wrong word. As allies, I'm sure they had an expectation of being put on notice if we had plans to set it off. But sometimes this isn't always going to be the case. Sometimes when you're dealing with an immediate threat, shit just kicks off spontaneously. And there's no practical opportunity to put everyone on alert. That's just the way it is. Merc209 wants to know, are you going to talk about it when it was official that Bulldogs were no longer allowed on the yard with Northerners and how it happened? Yes, I will. In fact, I'm going to be covering a lot of issues involving the Bulldogs, their history, incidents that took place in their county jail, and how that whole conflict escalated. This is something I'll be covering over the course of the next few weeks. In my last live, I announced an upcoming interview that I'm going to be dropping with a former CO that worked at the FCJ, the Fresno County Jail. This interview will branch off into some of the history, how and when the rift started, and when it became official on all California mainlines. Eno Darren wants to know, I'd be interested in a spill where you go more into how you feel about the pain you've caused others. A lot of them relatively innocent, and the level of remorse you have looking back on it now. You touched on it here and there, but never really so much about how you feel about it and why. Yes, this is something I can most definitely talk about and expand on. As you pointed out, I have spoke about some of the remorse that I felt with regard to some of the people that I victimized in the past, and I do feel bad about it. But I'll make a point of specifically addressing this like you asked. If I don't do it during an episode of Inner Demons, maybe I can do it during a live or in the form of a profile. So Berto wants to know, did any of your camaradas ever do time in the Nevada system? Yes, I've had homeboys that have done time in the Nevada prison system. As a matter of fact, I believe my boy, Smokey from Salinas, had a younger brother, Junior, that did time there. But I remember others over the years who got caught up out there and did time as well. So Itachi L wants to know, what county or city laces the homies the best to be ready for the pen, besides Salas? From what I've seen, and just from my own observation, I think San Jose, Santa Rosa, Sacra, and Tulare counties have all tried to do it right. Enlightening younger norteños that were blind and destined to the pinta used to be a priority that was pushed across the board. It was not only a priority, but it was also a fundamental responsibility that we all used to take serious. We understood that we were doing these youngsters a disservice if we didn't educate and school them. Because if we didn't, they were at risk of falling victim to some of the schemes and deception that's effectuated in prison. So Benny Vargas wants to know, I heard you say that Chocolate pulled you as a bro. Can you elaborate a little on that and tell the viewers a little more about him? I know a lot. I really wish I could elaborate and tell the viewers more about Chocolate, but unfortunately, I only know what I've already said. My interaction with him consisted of the brief encounter that I had with him at his door in West Block. Literally, it was less than 5 minutes. I was housed on yard side and he was housed on bay side, so I wasn't even aware of who he was or his presence until Puerto Rican Puppet told me to go over there and introduce myself. I wish there was more I could talk about, but that was it. So M. Eyes wants to know, is it true it takes a certain individual to run the streets for a living and live to be 30? Not everybody is cut out for it. You gotta have heart and instinct. Absolutely. Like I've said before, everyone who runs the streets and who lives that type of lifestyle isn't always fortunate enough to see 30. The streets are brutal and unforgiving. People lose their lives every day out there. I lived to be 52 because I believe I'm street savvy and I knew how to play prison politics. I don't think luck had anything to do with it. That's exactly the message that I try to pass on to these youngsters. That if this is the game they really want to play, that they might not live as long as I have. When you put yourself in those types of situations where you're out there shooting, stabbing, and hurting people, and people are out there trying to shoot, stab, and hurt you, eventually fate's gonna prevail. So Christian Maciel wants to know, would you mind doing an episode on the most vicious, brutal thing you saw while in prison? Definitely, Christian. I just gotta figure out what platform I'm gonna do it on. Maybe I'll just run it on an episode of War Stories. But yeah, I think that would be a good topic to talk about, so I appreciate the idea. So Madden Football wants to know, is it true with the integration that they are also letting out the generals and the big homies out of the shoe, sending them back to the main line? Is that true? Yes, it is true. This is old news though. They've already released most of these guys from the shoe. This started a couple years ago. As far as the integration of the yards, this has also been in effect for a while now, but the merging of the yards has only been implemented on the lower level yards like the 1 and 2 yards. They started pitching it like it was a pilot program that they were gradually integrating into the mainline, general population yards. But it had problems as soon as they started mixing the yards. They stopped short of trying to do it with the higher level yards, like the level 3 and 4 yards, because I think they knew they'd be recovering bodies. But it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out when they resume things and start merging again. So Juan Besserol wants to know, my 11-year-old son is starting to talk about norteños and asking questions. What advice would you give to him on a straight path? Man, dealing with kids is tough, man. However, I think you're taking notice of some of the early warning signs just in time. I always said that the magic number was 12. That if you couldn't pull a problem at-risk kid out of the streets by the age of 12, that it was too late and that you were going to lose them. But this is just my opinion, and I'm obviously not an expert in this area. So realistically speaking, all kids are different, and what might work for one might not necessarily work for another. For me, I stopped being receptive and I closed my mind to all those that were trying to help me at around 12. Once I had been exposed to the streets and I reached a certain threshold, there was no pulling me back or saving me. I didn't want help, and I had some good people trying to help me. Anyway, as far as what you might be able to tell these young kids that are at risk, there's not any magic words or anything specific that comes to mind. All you can do is try to tell them how they're headed down a wrong path of self-destruction and how the bad choices that they make early on in their lives will have a profound and long-term negative effect later on in their lives. You have to sit them down and have a lot of heart-to-heart father-son conversations where you can put all these things in perspective for them. Explain how the whole gang thing is nothing more than a facade and a convoluted cesspool of smoke screens. Take them to the morgue and show them what the bullet-riddled body of a gang member looks like. Show them what the effects of long-term drug usage does to people. Explain how there is no more loyalty within these organizations and how prevalent betrayal has become. Tell him if he wants nice things in life like houses, cars, money in the bank, etc., he needs to start laying that foundation now, and that if he doesn't, he's always going to be playing catch up and living from paycheck to paycheck. You have to hit all the key points. I'm sure you already know these areas you need to expand on. As a father, But you have to be hands-on and you have to be relentless about it. That window of opportunity is closing, bro. He's close to that threshold where you're either gonna get through or you're gonna lose him. So hopefully this helps. So Moai14 wants to know, what's the relationship with your kids? The relationship between me and my son is non-existent and strained because of my son's mother. She did an amazing job of raising him, and he's not into gangs, drugs, or the type of lifestyle that I lived growing up. And I'm grateful for that. But unfortunately, he's allowed the overbearing ways of his mother to affect the relationship I once had with him, and it just got to be too much to handle. When he's ready to cut the umbilical cord and stand on his own 2 feet, then I'll be there as a father, and we can finally establish a relationship that isn't dictated by his mother. The relationship with my daughter is on a lot more solid ground. The only negative thing about my relationship with her is that she's already made me a grandfather at such a young age. Seriously, I have 3 beautiful granddaughters, and my daughter has grown up to be a strong, independent, hardworking mother who I couldn't be any more proud of. The one thing I will say is this: I gave up my kids for the NF. When I was younger and had just been recruited into the NF, I didn't want to expose my kids to that type of lifestyle, and I felt like it was just better to step back away from their lives. And although my intentions were good at that time, in essence, I became a deadbeat dad as a result. I would have rather been that than to bring all that negativity into their lives. So it took me years to mend these broken relationships. And to this day, the ramifications and the fallout that all this caused is still something that is being worked on today. So Makina Listo wants to know, how many gold stars and smiley faces did you hand out during your career? That's pretty funny, my boy. I know what you mean. Too many to count, my boy. I'm assuming you're referring to all the different accolades and kudos I gave during the time when I was delegated the position of a maestro, right? Yeah, I gave out lots of stars and smiley faces because I had the opportunity to work with some highly intelligent and intellectual individuals. So Justice Caton wants to know, can you discuss weapons and communication tactics? I'll go into this either on a live or during an upcoming episode of my new series called Game Time. Reason being is that these 2 topics cover a broad area, and in order to really discuss them, I'll have to elaborate in detail in a lot of different areas. Example, just weapon tactics alone requires talking about construction and why different materials are utilized, how it's made and different tactics used to ensure that it's indurated, concealment and why different points are used, sharpening tactics and other tactics used to avoid detection, when and how to use a weapon, scare tactics, etc., etc. These are just some of the areas, so I'll put something else together where I can expand in detail. So JR wants to know, you ever have a one-on-one with an Omerta? Yes, I have. Check out my War Stories series. I believe episode 13 is about an incident I had with an Omerta. So Sucker Free Gang wants to know, is it true that fools that have put in real work, you know what I mean? Yeah, I know what you mean, my boy. Do the spirits of those come to haunt you, of those that are no longer? I guess this all comes down to who you ask and their personal beliefs. I don't believe that the spirits of those who have been killed or victimized come back to haunt their killers or those responsible for perpetrating violence against them. That's just my opinion though. So Jerry Sloan wants to know, what is the tattoo on the back of your head? The tattoo on the back of my head is nothing more than an Aztec themed bird that I used to cover up the Nuestra Familia tattoo I once had. There's no meaning, no significance behind the type of bird it is, and it has no representation value. So Big Joe Rodriguez wants to know, can you share anything you might know that happened with Chuko, so-called checking out? I have no information about Chuko checking out, and I can't confirm whether he did or didn't. Those rumors were propagated by another YouTube channel, and I personally believe that it was said without merit or any factual standing. That's a problem that I've had to contend with for a while now. People that were never part of the NF now speaking as if they are in the know. I'll be dropping some content relating to both the state and federal rift, as well as some updates with regards to the state branch. So Rick Davis wants to know, how in the fuck are you able to get all those copies of ADX? You working for law enforcement? Isn't that private? This fucking dude. Every now and then, I'll get a question from a boneheaded dummy like this, and I usually don't even respond. But I'm gonna make an exception in this case. Little Ricky Davis, first of all, no, I don't work with law enforcement, and no, I didn't get copies of those phone calls from ADX from law enforcement. I guess I shouldn't really expect nothing less from a dumbass like you for assuming something like that. But it is what it is. I don't feel like I need to explain myself to you, and I'm not. But for the other viewers who might have read your boneheaded question, I'm just gonna say this. In the past, a similar question was asked about these phone calls, and some of you may or may not remember what I said, so I'm just gonna say it again. These phone calls were part of my discovery when I got indicted in 2005. They were downloaded on a disc by the district attorney and were then given to my attorney under Brady discovery. Little Ricky Davis, if that's even your real name, maybe you're not familiar with my history and my past, but next time you address me and ask a question, act like you got some sense before you show your ass again. So Martin 9400 wants to know, what is your opinion for individuals that co-sign for someone by introducing them to their inner circle, basically giving their stamp of approval for everything that that individual proclaims to be, an NF member, NR member, or part of a regiment, only later to accuse that individual of lying? I've always believed anyone that goes along with someone else's lies automatically brings their own credibility into question. Absolutely. Good question. This is something that I've seen take place and happen right here on YouTube all the time. You get one idiot that invites another idiot onto his channel, and they both stamp each other with approval and talking each other up for the purpose of giving credence to all their lies. It's hilarious. How many times have you seen it happen yourself, Martin 9400? Both of these cats call each other real ones and spend the whole video swinging on each other's nuts. Pretty pathetic, right? As far as my thoughts on it with regards to how it's applied within the organization and how it's effectuated to co-sign for someone else, I used to see it happen quite a bit. And I think anyone who's willing to do something like that can't be trusted themselves. I very rarely co-sign for anyone. While I was active, and even now as I manage a YouTube channel, you'll never hear me introduce someone and say, he's a real one. This guy was as real as they come, and I can vouch for everything he says. And if I ever do give someone my stamp of approval, I can guarantee you that it's been done for far and few. The one thing that I do take serious and place a lot of emphasis on is my credibility and to come across as a trustworthy and believable dude. People can say whatever they want about me, and they can paint me with whatever color brush they want. But regardless of all that, I'm brutally honest and transparent, and can't nobody take that away from me. Name dropping is another form of trying to give themselves or someone else that same false sense of credit. Some of these guys will drop credible names of reputable people, and they'll try to play off that credibility to benefit from it themselves. Straight scandalous. So Left Inland wants to know, so in the South, as you know, we are in an alliance with the whites and North allies with the blacks. Due to this, we were taught disdain for the blacks and for not only opposing political reasons, but a difference in mannerisms, respect, loudness, and even different hygienic characteristics. I'm not sure if there was a question here or if this was a statement, but I'll just say this. The hatred that a lot of you were taught was the result of other people's prejudices. It's all part of the propaganda machine that was propagated for political purposes. Unfortunately, there's smoke screens concealing the real issues that are involved. And this is bought into by the masses because it's all carefully laid into the organization's philosophical belief system. Brick by brick, this is systematically instilled in the hearts and minds of the youngsters who are still inspired and glorified by the so-called cause. On both sides. It's instilled the same way we were all taught to hate each other as norteños and sureños. Most of us didn't even really understand why we were supposed to hate each other, but yet we still honored and answered that call. It's all part of the bigger purpose to keep that hate going. My question is, despite an alliance, and this was by the same person, have you seen NF members who dislike blacks for the same reason I stated, or is that mindset just not indoctrinated? I think some of that same hatred was instilled in a lot of these guys well before some of them went to prison and were exposed to these criminal organizations. It's a sad reality, but it's still a reality. As far as it being indoctrinated, unfortunately, there's always going to be that small percentage of people who are going to try to pass down some of their personal self-serving beliefs. But for the most part, I don't think it's something that's widely indoctrinated. I can't say that the NF is completely void of some of its members who think or feel this same way, but I personally have only seen a small percentage of NF members who preach this type of hate. So Bird5091 wants to know, were you doing time during all those lockup raw episodes, documentaries, politics, with that and what followed? What was the word on the curb as far as no talking to cameras, journalists, etc.? The beginnings of Omerta in the system and why they're implemented. I know these politics came from the beginning of time, but a brief breakdown and summary for those that don't know. Thoughts on actives having social media accounts, primarily YouTube. Talking about prison politics. Do you think if they go back, they're deemed no good? So there's two questions there. So for the first part, yeah, I was doing time back in the days when Lockup Raw, Gangland, and a lot of other journalists were coming into the system to do documentaries about prison politics. As you pointed out, the code of silence dates all the way back to the days when real convicts were real convicts. Talking about prison politics was always a no-no, and this is something that's always been adamantly enforced. Prison organizations have always maintained a deep level of secrecy and have always shied away from media exposure. Inmates who openly talked freely to cameras or some of the journalists were either hit or ostracized by other inmates. The general belief amongst the majority of the inmates is that if someone is willing to talk to the cameras, then they would more likely be willing to talk to the cops. In prison or behind the walls, there's always a fine line when it comes to trust. Trust amongst inmates has been something that's been hard to establish. It's hard to trust anybody and everybody's suspect. So when you have other people like journalists or camera crews come into a prison, they're looked at by the inmates as intruders, invaders who are completely disconnected from their inside world. Anyone who interacts with them are watched and scrutinized closely. That's just the way it is. Prison operates like a secret sect. It has its own set of rules, laws, codes of conduct, and a strict level of secrecy. So whenever these lines are crossed or become blurred, it becomes a problem. As far as actives having YouTube channels, it's like this, man. Actives can have YouTube channels and they can partake in social media, but there's always been a fine line about what they can and cannot talk about. Someone who's active might decide to talk exclusively about sports, current world affairs, the music industry, health and fitness, or whatever it is that they choose to talk about. But any form of prison politics is completely off the table. I think if someone's active and they decide to begin discussing the going-ons in prison and they begin to pick and choose what they think might be deemed as prison politics, I think it's a bad idea and that they'll eventually cross that line. I've seen it happen. I've seen YouTubers create channels and debut it by claiming that they won't discuss this, they won't discuss that, they won't mention this, they won't use titles, etc., etc., etc. Initially, they kept it what they call G. They kept it G by avoiding all the politics and staying away from anything that could be construed as prison politics. But eventually, whether it's because a viewer asked them an open-ended question or whether they just got too complacent over time, they eventually cross those lines and begin talking about things that will get them in trouble. Honestly, if some of these guys lie or don't mention their standings, I gauge it and can figure out whether they're active or not based on what type of things they're willing to talk openly about. And of course, anyone that claims that they've been given a hall pass to speak freely about prison politics is definitely a charlatan or a fake who's fronting. So SC wants to know, hey Box, where is the story about you and the police chasing the box truck? And the second question by a different viewer, Jesse Rodriguez. You were in a high-speed chase in a box truck and you flipped it. Can you elaborate? I've never heard that story. So here's a response for both of you. I'll tell you what, since I have two of you asking about that same incident, I'll just go ahead and cut that into my next war story. I told it on the channel before. I think it was typed out in a profile format, but I've never done it in an open platform like this, so that's what I'll do. I hope you guys have enjoyed this Q&A. I know it's been a long time since I dropped a Q&A, but I'm going to start doing them on a consistent basis again. If you guys have questions for the next one we do, drop them in the comment section in the community or under the short Q&A video. With that said, I just want to thank all of you for your positivity, for your support, and for all the encouraging feedback. We appreciate you, as we realize that without you, our viewers, we would cease to exist.